breaking and entering, drunk and disorderly, law and order. A former prosecutor and a defence lawyer, not your typical pairing. And the result? Conversations about crime and punishment that are guaranteed to get you thinking.
Welcome to Justice Matters, a weekly podcast. Our episodes are available every Monday on Apple Podcast, Spotify and YouTube. Follow us on Instagram and TikTok. Enjoy the episode. This episode contains descriptions of animal cruelty, racism and violence. Listener discretion is advised. Hello, Lizzie.
Hello, Joe. How are you?
I am well.
Excellent.
We've got another old case. I'm worried about saying I want to talk about an old case because you make jokes about me being old then.
Well, if the shoe fits.
This is a very old case. So we did the one for the murder of the Earl of Errol from 1941.
Yes.
This is an animal cruelty case from 1903.
Wow, we are going back.
Way back.
Okay.
Yeah. It's a case I have known about for a long time, that of George Edalji. E-D-A-L-J-I, Edalji.
Is this Australian?
No, not Australian, English. Because I had to look at it for my doctoral thesis, and I think I had a little paragraph on it in my thesis. I meant to
What was that thesis on?
It was on new and fresh evidence in appeals, but I had to look at the history of the development of the Court of Criminal Appeal in England. And this was really the straw that broke the camel's back in terms of it being created.
Right. Now, Sidebar. Did you know that you can now have subsequent appeals in Queensland?
Oh my God, don't even start me. That is the worst legislation.
Okay, we'll come to that another episode.
Oh my Lord.
Let's see where it all began.
What a political sop. Okay, so, well, I might just talk briefly about the case, then I'll talk about the Court of Criminal Appeal, and then I'll go back to the facts of this case, because it is just a horrible miscarriage of justice, really stemming at its core from deep-seated racism.
Is this the one, just as a little breadcrumb?
Little Easter egg.
That Sherlock
Arthur
Holmes.
Conan Doyle, the author of Sherlock Holmes, was, yes, involved in.
I thought so. All right, good. Okay.
Yes.
Excellent.
So in 1903, there is some maiming of animals, mostly horses and cattle and sheep, that occurs in a place called Great Worley, which is in Staffordshire in England. And a man, George Edalji, who's a 27-year-old solicitor of Indian and English descent. He's of mixed ethnicity. He is charged with and convicted of one of those offences and is sentenced to 7 years.
So is maiming, does that mean the animals were killed?
Most of them died, yes. I will go into a little more detail later, although it's quite gruesome and sad. And the case against him was circumstantial and quite weak, but he was nonetheless duly convicted by a jury. And then there was a large public outcry and a lot of pressure put on the Home Office in England, and this was the case where finally it was decided that there was no mechanism to overturn a jury's verdict. So there had been legislation and arguments in Parliament for 60 years about creating an appeal from a jury verdict, because there'd been appeals in a civil case. If you're suing in a contract case and you have the trial and you lose, you could always appeal that. But if you were in a criminal case and a jury decided that you were guilty, you couldn't appeal that. There was no mechanism for appeal. That was it.
So for a civil case, was it called a court of appeal?
Yeah, it was the Court of Appeal.
But only for that jurisdiction?
Only for civil matters, yeah.
Yep.
Nothing for criminal matters. So, as I say, 60 years had been different legislation put up to the Parliament, but had never passed. And finally, after a number of cases, one of them was Florence Maybrick, which we talked about in our poisoning episode. And another one was George Edalji. It was the last of them. And it was such a huge outcry that in 1907, so he's convicted in 1903, 1907, the Court of Criminal Appeal is created in England, and then Australia follows, within a decade of that, where each state then has its own Court of Criminal Appeal.
And why was there such an outcry? Was he particularly popular or?
Oh, I don't think he was particularly popular. I think it was such a gross and obvious miscarriage of justice.
Right.
And as authorities always do in this case, they just defend their original decision, come hell or high water, and then make themselves look even stupider as they do that. And so that then builds public pressure against them. But also because Arthur Conan Doyle, if not the most famous, certainly one of the most famous authors at the time, he got involved, and that brought an enormous amount of publicity to the case.
So when you say this was about racism, do you mean racism by the police?
Racism by the police, yes.
So obviously the public were on Adalji's side.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll jump into it in a second. I'll explain the racism. But I think the racism, like racism tends to be, it's a vocal minority rather than the majority.
Right. Because
he did have an enormous amount of support amongst the general public.
Okay.
But anyway, I'll talk about that. So this, I have gone back and dipped into one of my, not one of my favourite novels, but I really enjoyed it. Julian Barnes' Arthur and George, for those watching on YouTube. I'm holding it up now. 2005 Booker Prize shortlist.
Oh.
Yeah, and it's a novelisation of the case, Arthur being Arthur Conan Doyle and George being George Adalji. But there's been a couple of other books written about it, most recently in 2021. What was it called? The Case of the Parsi Lawyer, I think it's called.
Oh, right.
Because some the letters of Arthur Conan Doyle in relation to the case became public a couple of years ago. So
interesting.
A new book was written about it. So if anyone wants to deep dive into those, I can certainly recommend Arthur and George. I really enjoyed it.
I love that you bring real books. I read real books.
You need to bring them along. Hold them up for the camera.
Well, I do a lot of my reading for the episodes online.
Ah.
Yes.
You're so newfangled. I'm old-fashioned, as you know.
Well, I like to read a novel, but my research I do online.
Well, I was actually thinking about, Arthur Conan Doyle gets involved in this case. What would a modern equivalent be? And I thought, since you're a Lee Childs fan, imagine if Lee Childs got involved with a real case and started investigating it and,
Maybe I should recommend that to him because he's retiring from writing his novels.
That's right. His brother's taking over or something.
So he might need something else to do.
There you go. Do real cases.
I'll help him.
All right. So let's talk about the Adalgis. So Shapoorji Adalji was George Adalji's father, and he was a vicar of Great Worley. So Church of England, minister, and he had the parish of Great Worley. And he was a vicar there for 40 years.
Wow.
And so he was a Parsi, so from India, and he had married an English woman, and they had settled back in England, and he had been given this job as the vicar of Great Worley, which was a fantastic position because it came with an income and it came with a house, a large house with grounds. But it was in a all-white community. So he is...
Interesting.
Indian extraction, and he is the vicar, a position of some prominence. And so he was, from 1875, when he took the vicarage over, subject to intermittent racism and racial abuse. And so his son, George, who was the oldest of the three children, who's mixed ethnicity, he went to the local grammar school, and then he went off to Birmingham to a university and he studied law. But during his childhood, he was also subject to racism. And looking at the racism is, in a bit more detail, is important because it does it gives you an understanding of the police involved in the case, but it also gives you an idea of what happened at the trial, because it was a really interesting, I found, trial to look at in terms of how the cross-examination was run and how he got convicted, because the case was really quite weak.
So sorry, I know I should have been listening.
No.
But where did the offending take place? Was it in Great Worley?
Great Worley, it was.
Worley.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So that is a rural area which also has, I think, a coal mine. And so the horses
were workhorses.
I think often were workhorses. There was also some cattle and sheep that were maimed. But the horse, he's eventually convicted of one horse maiming, and it was a colliery horse, so pulled wagon loads of coal, something like that.
So he went to Birmingham for his degree and then moved home again to practice law.
Well, Great Worley is close enough on the train that he could just train into Birmingham. So Great Worley is like a satellite town of Birmingham.
Oh, okay.
So
I don't have any geographical knowledge.
I didn't either. I had to look it up. So he would be on the 7:39 a.m. train to his office in Birmingham, and then he would come home again. But he never married, and he lived with his parents up until this point. And then I think when he got out of jail, he moved in with his sister, but never married.
Okay. Well, he's still only young, 27.
Yeah, that's right. But I think... Yeah.
I suppose in those days, you probably got married younger, didn't you?
Yeah. But anyway. When he is young, when he's 12 years old, so 1888, there are this poison pen campaign starts. And so the family, the Adalgis, receive letters which are sort of odd, written strangely, very strangely worded. And the first one says something like they need to subscribe to a particular newspaper, otherwise their windows had been broken, and the vicar just ignores that, and then subsequently the windows are broken. So he then takes that a bit more seriously and he goes to the police. And then after that, more letters turn up, including, and this gets a bit scary, letters turn up inside the house.
Oh, no.
They're not just delivered in the post. They are found, on the table in the house. And written on, I don't know how they work this out, but written on exercise paper from the Adalji kids' exercise book, school exercise books.
Wow.
Yeah, I'm always a bit skeptical about that kind of evidence because obviously exercise books are produced en masse. And
yes, you didn't like it in the John Bonet case.
No, I didn't like it in the John Bonet case. And one of the letters which was on the table inside was wet, so it had been sort of delivered recently.
Yeah, that's scary.
Well, even more scary, there was graffiti both inside and outside the house.
Like racist
graffiti. And some of the poison pen letters threatened violence, but others didn't. And if you can see a lot of them online, they're just really odd, some of them, and written in a really strange way. And
was it like all consistent penmanship? Was it
no.
one per? No.
But so this poison pen letters appearing goes on for years.
Oh, right.
But the first sort of tranche of them in 1888, the Adalgis decide that it's their maid, Elizabeth Foster.
Okay.
And that's consistent with them turning up inside of the house and using paper from kids.
Yes.
She always denied it. And the vicar, Shapaji Adalji, he brought a private prosecution against her for writing these poison pen letters. She always denied it. She ended up pleading guilty, but because she didn't have enough money for a lawyer and because the prosecution, she was just going to get a slap on the wrist.
Right.
But obviously she left their employment and went and lived with her aunt. But she always denied it. And 4 years later, in 1892, they start again. There's more poison pen letters. And the police investigate and, they do things like place police around the house watching to see who's delivering these letters. And in the end, they decide on very little evidence that it's George Adalji writing the letters.
What?
Yeah, even though he's named in them and there's threatened violence towards him. And yeah. And
why?
Well, I think...
Because they saw him going in and out of the house?
Yeah, they saw him going in and out of the house, and there was things being delivered. So there was a bag full of excrement delivered at one point or left on the door.
Why do people do that? I know
that's a pretty standard one.
But I know it sends that message, but you've got to collect the poo yourself. Like, come on. There's got to be a better way to send a message.
I don't know. People are picking up poo all the time. Dog poo, I see them on the street. They're picking up their dog's poo.
I just think.
That's why I don't have a dog. I'm just not prepared to do that.
Oh, well, you're missing out. Dogs are amazing.
Anyway, so they decide that George Adalji's writing, and they stop investigating. And so for the next few years, these poison pen letters keep arriving.
Sorry. So they think he's doing it, but they take no action.
Yeah. And Mrs. Adalji, she complains to the chief constable of the Staffordshire Police. And he says, well, if you want to stop it, go and tell your son to stop writing them.
No.
Yeah. So he actually is really quite problematic in the whole case. So his name is Captain the Honourable G.A. Hanson, Captain Hanson.
Okay.
And his captaincy is not through the police, it's through service he did in the military. And
right.
And if you're captain or above, you can keep your title when you go into civilian life.
Ah.
So he's captain.
Still?
Hanson.
Is that
I think
still
that's still the case, yeah. I don't think anyone really uses it, but...
I'd love to have a captain.
Would you?
Well,
Okay.
I think of Captain Von Trapp from The Sound of Music.
Oh, The Sound of Music. That's right.
I would have married him if he was my age.
Wow. Okay. There you go. There's an insight into your psyche.
Yes,
for
yes.
the listeners.
Sorry, David.
So, and he's a chief constable of Staffordshire Police, not because he's a policeman, but because he's sort of the local notable gentry. So you will recall, no doubt, back in the day that magistrates tended not to be legally trained, and they just tended to be whoever the local dignitary was, whoever the most important person in the area was, and then they were the ones who would sign off on search warrants and in fact sit as a magistrate in court and that kind of stuff. I mean, we haven't done that in Queensland for a very, very long time. But this bloke was the chief constable of the Staffordshire Police because he was, he has the title the Honourable because he's the son of a lord or something.
He was very titled, Captain
Captain the Honourable.
Honourable.
Yes. So he he's just seems to be quite clearly a racist, just out and out racist.
Wow.
And he is against the Adalgis, always. So he's the chief constable of Staffordshire Police for the whole time. 1888 letters, the 1892 letters, and then into the 1903
charges.
Yeah. And he is always convinced that it's absolutely George Adalji doing it.
Do we think just based on his race? Like, had there been any
there was some
run-ins between them, or?
Well, the run-ins between them had been this poison pen campaign that the Adalgis had asked the police to investigate, and they'd investigated, but they never really caught anybody. And they eventually stopped investigating on the basis that it was George Adalji.
Right.
So George Adalji himself was a sort of a quiet young man, diligent at school, a bit of a nerd.
What sort of law did he practice?
Well, interestingly, he wrote a book called Railway Law for the Man on the Train.
Sorry?
Railway Law for the Man on the Train.
What does that even mean?
I don't know. It was part of some legal publisher decided to do a sort of a everyman series of books for the Man on the Clapham omnibus.
Railway law, as in the things you can and can't do on a train?
I don't know. Well, see, this is a funny thing. There's these areas of law which are sort of not really a thing anymore, but horse law was a really big deal. I bought a textbook on horse law for my father years and years ago. I found it in some antiquarian bookshop. Yeah, and he loved horses, so I bought it from him as a bit of a lark. I mean, who even knew horse law was a thing? But obviously before cars, horse law was an absolute area of the law.
That's hilarious.
Yeah. So railway law before everybody owned a car was obviously a thing. And he wrote a book, and pretty good. He wrote a book he wrote it as a 26-year-old, I think.
Well, good on him.
And I think it was the only book in the area.
That doesn't surprise me.
And it was well received amongst the legal fraternity.
I wonder if there was a lot of cases in that area.
Yeah, I don't know. There might have been.
Okay, all right, interesting.
So he, finished school with good grades, went off to university, got good grades in his law school. I think he finished top or almost the top for the exams to become a solicitor.
Wow.
But then couldn't get a job. Nobody would employ him.
Again, because of racism?
I think probably. Well, I mean, if he's clearly not because of his ability. I mean, he's at the top or near the top of his class in his law class.
I actually didn't realise there was such racism for Indian heritage in the UK because I thought it was so prevalent.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Brick Lane in London, fantastic place to get some of the world's best curries.
I think of The Bill.
The Bill?
Remember that old show?
Right. Yeah.
That seemed to be quite the melting pot.
Yeah.
Everyone in together. That's what I thought British community was.
Yes. Well, I don't know the history of immigration from India or South Asia to England, but presumably it really didn't kick off until the 20th century. So
right.
The Adalgis are there in the late 19th century.
That's just, it's so wrong, isn't it? For someone with so much ability to not have opportunity.
Well, luckily his parents had enough money that he ended up opening his own law firm. And it ended up becoming a, successful enough law firm. It sort of gave him a living for his life.
Okay.
And so he would catch the train in every day to Birmingham, go to his office, and then he would come home in the evenings, and he would sometimes see clients at the vicarage at his house in the evenings. But he was very fond of an evening walk
A constitutional.
Yeah, an evening constitutional, which was a bit unfortunate in terms of providing opportunity to commit animal maiming. But he was well known for it, going for evening walks. Now, there's a couple of things I need to say about that. Firstly is obviously for those of us in Australia those of us in Queensland where the sun never sets later than 7 p.m. Obviously, this is England, so in the summer, the sun is not setting until 9 o'clock at night, 9:30 at night. So you could go to work and have a walk in the evenings and it still be daylight.
Right.
Now, that was important because George Dalgey had very bad eyesight.
Ah.
Yes, he had some form of myopia.
Okay.
Couldn't really focus on things that were more than a foot away from his face.
Wow.
So the idea that he could go out at night and sort of negotiate through paddocks was
a sticking point.
Well, a big sticking point because he just couldn't do it. Now, the downside was he could actually go out at night if he was on a familiar road. If it was a familiar road and it was a sort of a main road, he could negotiate that. But if you were just walking cross country, he really would have no hope. Yeah. And so that's one of the big issues that help acquit him later on. But but he's known in the area as somebody who goes for these evening walks. And then there's some conjecture that he would also be out after dark, although he always denied that. I think he always was home before the sunset. Some people said no, they'd seen him out after sunset. So, anyway.
But seeing him out is not the same as witnessing a crime.
No, that's right. That's right. Well, the evidence against him was pretty light on.
Yeah.
So what happens? We get to 1903. So he's a solicitor working in Birmingham, still living at home with his parents, and going to work every day, coming home, having these evening constitutionals. Now, there's another slightly odd fact that I have to give you, which featured at the trial, and that was that he slept in a bedroom with his father. And he had done since, I think, the 1888
poison pen
letters. And I think that the father started to sleep in the same room as his son, in part to make sure that he wasn't the one sending letters. Not that I don't think they ever really.
Oh,
seriously.
really?
Yeah. Even more odd, the father would lock the door at night.
Okay, that is a bit odd.
And unlock it in the morning. Lock it on the inside, though, because they're both in the room.
But who's he locking out?
I don't know. His wife.
Poor wife.
I don't know. Yeah, that's right. He's certainly sending a message, isn't he?
Yes.
So
okay,
that
can
becomes...
I just ask, like, were they in separate beds?
Yeah. Yes, they were in separate beds, honestly.
Well, I'm just checking.
They were in separate beds.
Very reluctant to give that fact, so I thought, is there any more to it?
I thought it was self-evident that they were in separate beds. Anyway.
Who would know?
Yes. All right, so they sleep in the same room.
Yeah, that is weird.
It is a bit weird.
Sorry, George, but no.
I mean, I think it's a bit weird too. But it does provide the perfect alibi.
Of course.
Because your father is the local vicar. I mean, if you had to get an alibi from someone, the local vicar would be the best person, wouldn't it?
Well, look, vicar is another word for priest.
Yes. I'm not from the Church of England. I think do they call them priests?
No, they call them vicars.
There you go.
But it's the same thing. And we've had some problem with the trustworthiness of
not
the
animal
clergy.
maiming. I don't think the clergy have been involved for all their faults have been involved in animal maiming.
You're holding him up as a paragon because he's a vicar. I don't know that necessarily follows. Not to disparage vicar.
Shapaji Dalgey,
no.
Dalgey. But don't forget, this is back in the day before organised religion had completely disintegrated in our society, in our modern decadent society. This was back in the day.
Leave that issue.
When they were a worthy person in the community. Anyway, we'll get to the how the prosecution get around what I would consider an ironclad alibi. We'll get to that when we talk about the trial. So we come to 1903, and as I say, he's 27. He's travelling to and from work, going for his evening walks, sleeping at night in a room
with his
daddy,
father,
and the door being locked, and had done that for 17 years or something.
Possibly why he wasn't married. Just saying.
Just throwing it out
there.
Okay. And in January of 1903, what a called The Great Whirly Outrages Begin, and that is the maiming of animals.
Just horrible.
Yes.
Animal cruelty is despicable.
It is. It is very horrible. So, I mean, maiming of animals was not unheard of in England, or I suppose in any rural societies, because it is often a good way of revenge against somebody you don't like, because the animal it's like damaging farm machinery.
Yeah, it's livelihood.
Absolutely. You really are attacking somebody's livelihood. And also, I mean, unlike, you don't sort of form a relationship with your ride-on mower, but you do, have a fondness for your horses, even if they are work horses.
It's something that stings.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think
More
some
so to the
people
horse. Yeah.
love their ride-on mowers.
Yeah, I mean, I'm all for a ride-on mower, but I'm not sure I would treat it the same as I'd treat a horse.
Good.
So horse ripping, I'll just briefly get into some details. I think it's important. There's a number of ways to maim a horse. One of them is to cut tendons in their legs.
Oh.
But another way, and this was the more common in the whirly outrages, is to slice them across their stomachs.
Oh, Joe.
So what that entails is that you approach a horse or cow, and so we know horses and cows sleep standing up. You might be familiar with cow tipping.
Yes.
So
Cars, the Disney, Pixar,
that's
whatever.
right. That's right.
Maida would go and tip over the cows.
Yeah, that's right.
Great movie.
So, in cow tipping, where you walk up to a sleeping cow and push it over, that's possible because you can creep up on a cow when they're asleep. I think a bit harder on horses. Horses tend to be pretty
twitchy.
Yes. But, I mean, if they don't see you as a threat and they've been around humans a lot, they'll let you approach right up to them. And then if you have a sharp enough implement, you can reach underneath their belly and you just slice from one side to the other.
It's just disgusting.
It's horrible. Absolutely horrible. And that injury, if done properly, will kill them pretty quickly because they'll
bleed out.
Well, their guts fall out. But even if you don't cut that deep, it's not a wound that you can stitch, and so that the horse will have to be put down because you cut through all of their muscle and you can't stitch it back up. And so you are, that the horse, even if it's still alive. And some of the horses, when they find them in the mornings, are still alive. So this maiming occurs at night. So farmers will go to bed and wake up the next morning and have a horse that's either dead in the paddock or standing there in incredible pain, with these horrible injuries, and have to then be put down.
And was it animals from a whole variety of farms?
Well, that's one of the pieces of circumstantial evidence. Almost all of this occurs within, a mile or half a mile of the vicarage.
Right.
So it's all in that sort of vicinity.
Okay. But it's not like one farm is being targeted.
No, they're different farmers. Well, one of them's a colliery pony, so it was owned by the
mining person.
Yeah, the mining people kept their ponies, but
so lots of victims.
Yeah, a number. Well, I mean, I think there was 8 attacks altogether. It was January, then there's one in February, then there's 2 or 3 at the end of June, and after the one in February, the rumor going around is that it's Georgia Dalgey doing it. Straight
away.
Yeah. Well, as I say, I think there's a vocal minority of racists living in the area who are happy to try and pin things on him. And he had been suspected by the police, certainly, of doing the poison pen letters. Yes. So there's this rumor going around that it's him. Now, so there's some in January, some in February, then there's no more until the end of June. And I think there's 2 on one night, 29th of June. I think there's 2 horses on one night. Now, as soon as that happens, the police decide it's definitely Georgia Dalgey, and they start staking out the house.
Right.
Which they'd staked out previously because they'd staked out the house for the poison pen letters, almost 10 years earlier. Now, exactly how many police are staking out the house becomes an issue at the trial, because later on, the defence say, how is Georgia Dalgey sneaking out if you guys are...
watching.
Yeah. And then the police have to backtrack and say, oh, no, we only had one guy there and he probably went home for dinner and all this kind of palaver. Yeah. Oh, yeah. So
there were more offences while they were watching his house?
Yes. So they start watching his house. They decide it's him. And then on a while later, so that's 29 June, on the night of the 17th and 18th of August, one horse is then maimed and subsequently put down. And then they arrest him.
So it sounds like obviously it's one perpetrator, but was there like evidence that they were all committed the same way? You know, was it clear it was the work of one offender?
No. Oh, sorry. So Arthur Conan Doyle eventually, spoiler alert, well, he published this in 1907, so I'm not really spoiling anything. He identified who he thought it was, and he identified one person.
Okay.
I must say, I didn't get the breakdown of the different animals. I know the one in August and the ones in June were horses, but there were sheep and cattle attacked as well.
Okay.
And maimed. Not all of them died, but most of them did. And if you are into that kind of gruesome stuff, you can see photos online.
Oh, really?
Of the bodies. I was looking at one this morning. Accidentally, I was looking for some other information about Great Whirly, and this comes up. They did a postcard of it. 2 of the horses, dead horses.
They did not?
They did. 1907 postcard.
Who is buying that postcard?
I don't know.
Okay, so they arrest him.
Okay, the arrest is interesting, so I might just go through it in a little bit of detail. So what they say is that they've got tracks leading from 2 of the attacks back to the house. There's some, they've got these evening walks that George Adalji goes on, and almost all of the attacks occur within, half a mile of the house. So when I say easy walking distance, I mean half a mile is out of K and a bit of the house. So, I mean, if you're going on a reasonable evening constitutional, you could
How
do
long
it.
would it take?
Well, it takes you an hour at ordinary walking post to walk 4 Ks. So it'd take, 40 minutes there and back.
Oh, so easy.
Yeah,
okay.
40-minute walk. Although it is over broken ground, so maybe it's slightly slower, but
yeah, not excessive.
Not excessive. So what happens on the night of the 17th, George, I think, goes through his usual constitutional. I think there's rain. It rains that night. Surprise, surprise, it's England. And then the next morning they find a horse that's been attacked and is put down.
And were the police watching his house that night?
Police are watching his house that night.
But only one policeman,
they at first they said there was a cordon of policemen, but then later on it was like, well, how did he get out if he had a cordon? They were like, oh, yeah, when I said a cordon, we mean one.
Oh, God.
It was one guy.
All right.
So they approach him. Sorry, they send a message. They find out very early in the morning there's a horse that's been attacked. And they get the local, the local layabout to run down to the station and tell George Adalji we want to speak to him. Because they knew he caught the 7:39 train to Birmingham.
Oh, the train station.
Sorry, the train station.
Yes.
So the local layabout runs down and says to George Adalji, the police want to speak to you.
Why did the police not go?
I don't know. They were dealing with a horse ripping. I don't know.
Oh.
Anyway, I think they were en route to sort of meet him and speak to him anyway. So George Adalji says, well, what do they want to speak to me about? And the bloke says, I don't know. And then he says, well, I'm busy. I've got meetings this morning. I've got to go to work.
Yeah.
And the bloke says, why don't you take a day off? Why don't you take a holiday? And George Adalji apparently sort of smiles at this comment because this is the local layabout suggesting that
he'd take a holiday.
He'd take a holiday.
Okay.
And Adalji says, I'm not going to do that. Now, the prosecution say during this conversation, somebody came up to them and said, oh, there's been another maiming of a horse, and that George Adalji smiles. This is part of their, case against
their
him.
evidence?
Yeah, this is part of their evidence.
Okay.
Adalji denies that. He said no one came up to him. It was just a conversation with him and the local layabout. And when asked why he didn't stop to talk to the police, he said, well, the guy had given me no reason to stop and talk to the police. And he's a solicitor, he's a lawyer. I mean,
yeah, he knows.
You know your rights. It's like I don't care what the police
I'm still
want.
stuck on why they sent some rando to tell Adalji anything.
Well, yeah, I don't know. Well, as I say,
bizarre.
I think they're dealing with the horse ripping and they said, pop down the station and grab him before he leaves. Anyway, Adalji says, I'm going to work.
And he did?
Goes off to work. So later in the day, they turn up to his office and they arrest him.
In Birmingham.
And he says when they arrest him, I've been expecting this for some time. And they then at the trial say, well, that's
an admission.
Yes.
What's your interpretation of that statement?
Well, he says, when they cross-examine on it, he said people had been saying that I was going to be arrested for this because I was doing it for months. And in fact, George Adalji had placed a reward to name the person who was making the rumours that he was going to be arrested.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he was so annoyed by it. He said, I'll pay a reward if you can tell me who's saying these rumours.
Oh, it's probably Captain the Honourable.
The Honourable Captain G.A. Anson. So that's why he said, well, I've been expecting this for some time.
All right.
Anyway, so he's arrested. Now, also on that day, so George Adalji catches his train to Birmingham. The police, since the local layabout comes back, running back to him, says he didn't stop and he's gone to Birmingham, they say, all right, well, let's go to his house. Let's go to the vicarage. And they go to the vicarage and they ask for, show us any weapons you've got. And the vicar and his wife produce a trowel, which is something you use. A
gardening tool?
Yeah, painting or whatever. Anyway, I think they don't do the search until after they arrest him, but they asked to see his boots and his...
Sorry, are they suggesting the trowel was used to slice?
No, they don't. They suggest some razors were used.
Okay.
But they don't get that on the first search. Because I don't think a trowel
would do the job.
A trowel is definitely not going to do the job. Horses have very thick hides. But they also get his house coat, which is a coat he would come home. You come home in your suit and you take your suit coat off and you put on
like a dressing gown.
Oh no, more like a sort of a farm coat.
Oh, okay.
And then you go walking. My dad had one.
Oh, okay, right.
So we had
like your outdoor
farm.
coat.
Yeah,
casual.
Yeah, although they often tend to be sort of a bit more like a trench coat, a bit longer,
right?
But made of sort of
sturdy.
Drill cotton or something. And
okay.
Anyway, so they produce a farm coat, and apparently it's wet. And so they say, well, it rained last night, and there we go. And then there's some argument about whether there's hairs on it. So the police say to Shapajir Jalji, the local vicar, oh, look, there's hairs on this. And the vicar says, where? And they say, here. And he says, well, that's not a hair, that's a loose thread. And they say, no, there's hairs there. And they take the coat. And they give the coat to the local doctor. And this is the standard of expert evidence in the case, the local GP. And they say, can you have a look at this coat and do an analysis? So the local doctor, he says he gets 29 horse hairs off the coat,
Well, you say he says that. Did he produce them? No,
I don't think they were produced. It was just his oral testimony that's what he got.
Interesting.
He also says there's blood on the coat, but apparently it's spots of blood, was it
tested?
Which is it's 1903.
Oh, they couldn't test it.
I don't think in 1903 you can test really for, maybe you could determine it's human blood or animal blood.
Yeah, I would have thought you'd know about, haven't there been cases like that? It was pig's blood, it wasn't.
Yeah, but were they from the...
I'm not sure.
Well, all they do is...
You're the old expert.
Yeah, I'm the expert on old forensic science. So they just say blood.
Okay.
Some spots of blood, which is consistent with not being... But presumably if the police grab the coat at the house and they're looking for something, the first thing it says, well, there's blood on this coat. So they don't even see it when they first grab it. So it's just these small spots of blood. Anyway, there's some conjecture about... Well, I don't think there's any conjecture about the spots of blood, but there's some conjecture about the hairs on the coat and whether they were there at all, because Vicar Shapajir Dalji, the vicar, says there were no hairs on the coat.
Well, and how would the doctor necessarily be able to tell they were horse hairs? He's not a vet.
No, again, I would have been objecting to his expertise straight out the gate. Yeah. I love a good evidentiary argument in the trial.
Of course you do. I have to say I'm disappointed with the prosecution so far.
Oh, it gets worse. But run brilliantly if you are interested in trial advocacy by the prosecutor.
Okay.
Really does a good job in threading together a pretty flimsy case.
Yes.
Then they also say that the boots have mud on them, so he's been for a walk. Again, not inconsistent with what he does anyway.
Yeah.
But then they say that the boots have strangely worn on part of their heel, and that, they can see then by the different footprints in the paddock.
Where he's been.
Yes. Again, I think I would have absolutely objected to that evidence.
But I think
completely spurious.
I think back then, things like footprint and tire were often the biggest kinds of
not
physical
tire,
evidence.
Footprints, yeah, absolutely.
Oh, tires.
But I agree. But it's not great. I mean,
no,
for somebody
but it's what they had to work with at the time.
Sure.
Like, it's not like they were going out on a limb looking for footprints.
No, sure.
That was fairly standard.
Standard practice.
And working out height and weight from the depth of a footprint, like that was all very...
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Was that Sherlock Holmes? Did he do height, weight from the...
I think they could extrapolate, physicality from footprints.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, nowadays I don't think footprint evidence would be particularly strong.
Well, there'd be other better types of evidence to be finding, I guess.
Yeah. So they get his boots, they get his coat, and then later on, I don't know if it's on that day or a day later, they go and they search the house and they find razor blades from shaving razors. And they say that the razors are wet.
What?
When the vicar had said, yeah, we don't use those. They're in the bottom of a cupboard or something. And
this was days after?
Oh, I think it was within 24 hours.
But surely a little razor, if it had been wet,
would have been dried.
Would have dried in that time. Like, that seems very odd. Unless it was in a puddle of water, which then...
Interesting. So they then have, but I'm not even sure. I mean, the kind of old-fashioned razor blades I'm talking, they're about an inch long, half an inch wide. And you'd have to,
you'd hold.
Yeah, you'd have to mount them on something. I think you couldn't just hold it in your hand because they're quite flimsy. And when you shave your face with them, you obviously load them into a razor, which you then so you just have the edge of them sticking out, so they're quite taut. Then you can shave it. So if you were going to slash something with it, you would have to load it into
the handle.
Yeah, and I mean, I think those were around. Those cutthroat razors are called that the barbers used.
And I'm thinking of the Man from
Ironbark. Yes, I know. What a great poem.
Yeah.
So they don't produce whatever it was loaded into. They say that these razors. And again, I'm just not sure you could kick that. I mean, horses' hides are very tough.
Well, to be fair, I did do work experience with a vet because I thought I wanted to be a vet. And that was when we lived in Rockhampton. So it was a country vet.
Yes.
And I actually participated in castration of horses.
And what did you use for that?
We used a scalpel.
Scalpel.
But it was surprisingly easy to do.
Did you actually do it or you just watched?
Well, I guided. He guided my hand for it.
Wow.
Yeah, it was. I also did preg testing on cows.
Wow. Okay.
Oh.
There you go. You're saying with that was such enthusiasm. I think you missed your calling. You need to go back and do that.
Well, do you know why I chose not to?
Why?
Well, because physics was the worst subject in the world, and it was a prerequisite. But also, I would not have been able to cope with the animals who died.
Ah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, you wouldn't have been good investigating this case.
No. Then. But anyway, so I think a razor possibly could do the job.
Maybe there you go. We've got some lived experience.
Evidence.
There you go, lived experience, expert evidence. And then what's the other? Then the other evidence against him is the things that he says. So the other thing that they put to him in cross-examination is why he didn't get bail. So he doesn't apply for bail, even though he'd probably get bail. And he says he doesn't apply because, firstly, they were keeping him in the prison hospital. I don't know why that was, but he said he was quite comfortable. Secondly, he said because the bail conditions on which they wanted to release him were so strict that it would have been too much of an imposition on his family. Because don't forget, he lives at home.
Oh, yes.
I mean, he's 27, so his parents are obviously getting on. They must have been, in their late 50s, early 60s. And this is at a time where the average age is much lower.
And so I thought you were going to say he didn't ask for bail so that he would have a very firm alibi if there were more killings. But was it quite well publicised that he'd been arrested?
Oh, yes. I think it was very well publicised.
So presumably the real offender wouldn't have continued.
Well, that's the other thing he says when they arrest him. He says, I think when they challenged him about bail, he said, I wanted to stay in jail so that when there was another maiming, you'd know it wasn't me.
Yeah.
And the problem is that some of the poison pen letters had started up again.
Oh.
And they were naming him and some other people as being involved in the horse ripping.
Like as a group? As
a group, the Great Whirly Gang or the Whirly Gang. And so the police were like, well, that's just because you knew the gang were going to go and
do it.
Yeah. But I mean, there's no proof that a gang ever existed.
They had an answer to everything, didn't they?
Oh, absolutely had an answer to everything. So they go to trial. So his alibi, as I said, ironclad, is that he was, so the prosecution case occurs, early morning, 1, 2, 3 a.m., something like that. And his alibi is, I am in a room with my father, who happens to be the local vicar, sleeping next to me, and we're locked in. The vicar, his father, gives evidence
to that effect.
He didn't leave the room all night. Now, you go.
So did they say he lied for his son?
Okay, so they don't openly say that. But the rule of thumb in trial, in trial advocacy is that you probably wouldn't say that as the advocate. You would leave it hanging for the jury to make that decision. Because if you say to the father, you're a liar, the jury hate you because they're like, that's a terrible thing to say to an old vicar. But if you just ask a whole series of questions and then leave that as a possibility which you don't name, they then go into the jury room and go, that vicar's an old liar.
Yeah.
Or, I mean, there's another possibility, and that is, and this is really how they painted it, that the parents were, old and they had sort of been duped by their son, who was this cunning, young, intelligent solicitor. Yeah. So the cross-examination of the mother was really interesting. All the prosecutor did is got her to talk about how wonderful and smart her son was. And of course she just falls straight in the trap and goes, oh, he's so smart and he won prizes at school and he's such a good son and he won prizes as a lawyer and he's now a well-respected solicitor. And,
why is that bad?
Well, because they paint George Adalji out as this cunning, very intelligent, you see, very cunning, and his parents out to be these...
Duped by him.
They're just these loving parents who sort of have stars in their eyes and don't realise that what he's doing behind their back.
Can I ask?
Yes.
Did they ever have to explain in court why the father and son shared a room?
I don't think that was ever explained. And yeah.
Because surely some of the jury would be like, what
weird.
The hell?
Yeah. WTF. Certainly some of the poison pen letters suggested that it was for nefarious reasons.
As in between them?
Okay, so this is occurring in 1903. So the suggestion was that one of the poison pen letters said something like, the vicar uses Vaseline like Oscar Wilde did. So Oscar Wilde obviously sentenced for sodomy in 1899. So
yes, the implication was clear.
Yes.
Although sodomy and incest is
next. That is
next level again.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, Oscar Wilde wasn't into that.
No.
So it's not explained. But the as I say, if I was a defence barrister and my client's alibi was that the local vicar will say that I slept in a bed next to him and never left the house, I would go, drop the mic, we've won this case. We're win. This is an easy win. And I think that's what happened to the defence counsel, because the defence don't call any evidence about George Adalji's eyesight. They don't really make it an issue because they're like, the case is so weak. It's just all about, he lived in the area, he walked at night, the animals were all sort of maimed in the area, there's horsehair on his coat, and then he says these odd things like he smiles when somebody says there's a horse ripping and he doesn't get bail. And
you're looking at it from the perspective that we know, presumably, he didn't do it. But when we think about circumstantial cases, I mean, that is a lot of different, pieces of not evidence, but facts that could be relied upon. Like you can understand.
Yes.
Putting aside the racism, you can understand why they would be bringing that case. Like it wasn't.
I can't. So with the circumstantial case, as you know, it isn't that you can thread that you can thread all the evidence together and that it's possible, or it's not even it's likely. It's got to be there is no other rational explanation that connects all these pieces of evidence except that the person is guilty. And there's lots of other rational explanations, like he just likes walking at night. His footprints lead back to the house because he walks in the area.
But I wonder if we're thinking of the offences, not of his habits. If we're thinking of the offences, and we've got this one person who goes for walks, who leaves the house, who has the horsehair apparently on the coat, all of that. The evidence of the poison pen, like who else is a suspect? Like if a jury are looking at all of that and there's no one else in the frame. Yeah. So I'm not on the prosecution side because it was a miscarriage. Yeah. But I'm saying it's not ridiculous that they brought the case,
Well, the problem is that the police, and this is often a problem, they don't really look at anyone else.
Yeah.
So it's not like they had somebody else that they could have charged. They never even looked at anyone else.
Which is a problem.
Yeah.
But, I mean, look, I'm not defending the prosecution. Maybe I'm defending the prosecution but not the police, perhaps.
What I found so interesting was the way the prosecutor approaches this alibi, and how do you get around that alibi for a prosecutor? And so what he does is he goes through. So there's a rule in advocacy: you never repeat in cross-examination testimony that's harmful to your theory of the case. So you wouldn't, if there's testimony that, you know, that's harmful, you really just don't repeat it, because you don't want the jury to hear that harmful testimony multiple times. Now, there is an occasion where you can go misère, as it were. You absolutely talk about every single thing that, you know, is against your case, and in doing so make it look ridiculous. And so that's what the prosecutor does. He goes through in minute detail the alibi. So he says to the vicar, so you sleep in the room with your son, you know, and in 17 years, you know, you say he's never left the room at night. You know, are you sure in 17 years never ever once had left the room? And, you know, you say that the lock is in the door. Now, where was the key? Oh, the key was in the door. Are you sure the key was in the door? Was the key always in the door? And he just goes through and he questions every single thing. You know, oh, the lock, you say the lock squeaked. Was it a loud squeak or was it a soft squeak? You know, and no matter which way you jump on that, it's problematic, because you say if it's a soft squeak, well, then you say, well, you wouldn't have heard it. If you say it's a loud squeak, you say, well, why didn't you oil it? And so he says, well, why didn't you oil the leak? And they go, I don't know. And he says, well, did you have oil in the house? Oh, I think so. We had it. Well, if it's a loud squeak, presumably you would have oiled it in 17. You know, was it always squeaked like that? And so he just goes through in minute detail and he makes the whole thing look ridiculous. But he gets this one really interesting point, and that is the father's evidence is that I would wake up with the squeaking lock. If someone turned the lock at night, I would wake up. And so the prosecutor said, so in 17 years, have you ever been woken up by that lock? And he says, no. And the prosecutor says, well, how do you know it would wake you up? You know?
Right.
So
can I ask, would this have been a time when, if Adalji needed to go to the bathroom in the middle of the night,
clearly
would it be a chamber
17
pot?
Years. Oh, yeah. I wonder about that. Maybe it was a chamber pot.
Because in 17 years, to not have to get up and do a wee.
Well, he's a non-drinker. You know, he's not a party animal. I mean, you know what it's like. You go out to a party and you're up 7 times.
No idea.
No idea. I'm pouring grog down my throat. I'm always up, going to the loo. Anyway, so George Adalji, you know, so the prosecutor does an excellent job.
Is there a transcript?
No, but I think there's a lot of reporting about it.
Right.
So he's duly convicted, 7 years hard labour, only does 3. So the retired Chief Justice of the Bahamas takes an interest in the case and writes to the Home Office. And he has one particular legal argument, which I think is a really good one. And that is this, that George Adalji is originally charged with the poison pen letters and the horse ripping on the 18th of August. But he's only tried on the horse ripping. But the evidence of the poison pen letters is introduced against him at the trial. As part of
the case.
Yeah, as if he had been the author, which had never been proved.
Interesting.
And so the Chief Justice of the Bahamas, retired, writes in and says, look, this is against the evidence laws in this country, writes to the Home Office. And so George Adalji amazingly gets parole at the 3-year mark.
Because of that? Well,
is it because of that, or who knows? You know, suddenly he's just kicked out of the door of the jail and he's on parole.
Yeah.
So that's 1906. And there'd been a petition, 10,000 signatures on a petition to the Home Office to investigate
that's a lot
it.
For back then.
So there was a huge groundswell of support, and his father and his mother were really out there, you know, trying to have his case overturned.
I like how you like petitions in your cases, but you don't like them in mine.
You had 4,000 on that petition you talked about. There's 10,000.
You are very contrary.
Anyway, so he then, somebody writes to, I think George Adalji writes to Arthur Conan Doyle, the most famous author of the day, or one of the most famous, you know, the author of the great detective Sherlock Holmes. Asks him if he'll take an interest. And Arthur Conan Doyle is at a particular point in his life, his wife had just died, and he had sort of been, I'm not sure he'd been having an affair or an emotional affair, he'd been in love with another woman for years, and he felt terrible that his wife had died, because that now allowed him to marry that he felt really conflicted by that.
Yeah.
Anyway, so this was a good distraction. So he jumps in boots and all to the case.
The poor mistress who'd waited all those years and now he's distracted.
I know. Well, he gets obsessed by the case. So they end up marrying George Adalji's invited to the wedding. Interesting.
Wow.
Yeah, they hit it off so well. They become friends.
Well, Arthur and George.
He's invited to the wedding. Anyway, on the honeymoon. So this cache of letters of Arthur Conan Doyle that have recently come into the public realm. He's writing letters on his honeymoon to Captain Anderson, who's the chief constable, telling him what a terrible case it was and asking questions.
Right.
So,
little distracted.
No, not distracted at all from his honeymoon.
Goodness.
Anyway, so what happens is he then investigates, and in 1907, so, within a year, he put together a feature article or a series of feature articles pointing out all of the weaknesses in the case. And he went back through and reinvestigated the whole thing, and he re-interviewed witnesses, and he found more witnesses. And so he really did a great job. And he actually names the person he thinks who did it. So he not only he's set to...
Who was it?
Well, I think a local bloke who lived in the area who'd worked as a butcher or something.
Not the layabout.
Not the layabout, no.
Thought he might have a reappearance in the story.
No. So, but what Arthur Conan Doyle does, obviously he's a super famous author, so anything he writes will be published, but he deliberately does not seek to copyright his work so that his articles verbatim can be reprinted by any newspaper that wants to.
Wow.
So those articles are then published all across the English-speaking world. Every paper wants to publish them. And so it gets an enormous amount of public pressure. And so the Home Office do an inquiry into the case, and they give a free pardon to George Adalji on the basis he wasn't guilty of the horse ripping. But even though he wasn't even tried for it, the inquiry says he wrote the poison pen letters. And so they refused to give him compensation. Isn't that terrible?
What?
Yeah.
But he was never convicted.
Never convicted of it. Yeah.
So a charge prevented compensation for a wrongful conviction.
Yeah. So George Adalji, he is, even though the inquiry says this, the solicitors board in Birmingham or whatever readmits him to the role. And so in 1907, he's back practicing as a solicitor, and he practiced as a solicitor from then until the 50s when he dies. And he lives the rest of his life quietly and soberly with his sister. And that case is then, it really highlights the problems with the English system of there being no appeal from a jury verdict.
Yes.
And so that's, as I said, the final sort of impetus to push through the Parliament, the act that creates the Court of Criminal Appeal.
Amazing.
And so, so the name George Adalji, for those of us who practice in criminal law and look at criminal appeals, is a very familiar one, and should be familiar to those who know anything about Arthur Conan Doyle. Holding up the book again, Arthur and George by Julian Barnes, for those watching on YouTube.
So I have talked about Adalji in broad terms in my subjects because I talk about appeals, but I did not have any real understanding of the depth of that case. That was...
fascinating, isn't it?
Poor George.
Poor George Adalji.
And those poor animals.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, good outcome for offenders everywhere with the
or innocent
right
people
to appeal.
Everywhere. Yes, that's right.
I didn't say guilty. I said offend. Oh, I see. All right. You know what I mean.
Thanks, Lizzie.
Thanks, Joe.
Thank you for listening to the episode. If you enjoyed it, please rate and review or like and subscribe. It all helps Lizzie and I keep this podcast going. If you're interested in clips, you can look at them on Instagram and TikTok. Just search for Justice Matters Pod. See you next episode.